It's September 1931. A trawler called the Calinda is working the North Sea at night, somewhere between two sandbanks fishermen call the Lehman and the Ower. The skipper is a man named Pilgrim Lockwood. His nets come up heavy, fouled with black sludge, the kind of muck that snags gear and wastes time. Fishermen have a word for it. They call it moorlog. Nobody wants it. It gets broken apart and pitched back over the side so the real catch can be sorted. Lockwood starts breaking up the clump with a shovel, and the shovel hits something that isn't peat, something hard. He bends down, picks it out of the muck with his hands. It's a piece of antler, carved into a point, lined with sharp barbs down one side. A harpoon. Almost perfect condition. Somebody shaped this on purpose a long time ago to catch something alive. Here's what should stop you. Lockwood is 25 miles off the coast of Norfolk. There is no land anywhere near him. Just gray water in every direction as far as the boat's lights reach. So who dropped a harpoon in the middle of the sea? Nobody did. That's the part that takes a minute to land. Nobody dropped it in the sea. Somebody dropped it on the ground. Dry ground, solid ground, ground you could stand on and hunt from. And the sea came later. Came up and over that ground so slowly, so patiently, that it swallowed an entire country without anyone who lived there ever getting to see it happen. You've probably pictured a lost land before. Atlantis, a city under the waves, and your instinct, if you have one, is probably the Atlantis instinct. A single catastrophic night, a wall of water, screaming, and then silence. One dramatic event you could point to and say, that's when it ended. That is not what happened here. And the true version is worse, in a much quieter way. Because what's under the North Sea right now, under the boats and the gas platforms and the gray chop the tourists find boring, is not the wreckage of one bad night. It's the residue of an eviction that took about 8,000 years. A process so slow that a person could be born on it, live a full life on it, raise children on it, and die on it without ever once suspecting that the ground under their feet was disappearing. There is a version of this story everyone already half knows, if they know it at all. A giant wave, a flood, a single day when it all went under. I'm going to tell you about that wave. It's real. It happened, and it was enormous. But I want you to hold on to something first, because it's going to matter later and I don't want to spoil it too early. New evidence suggests that wave might not be the ending you think it is. It might be something closer to a demolition crew showing up to finish off a building that had already been quietly rotting for years. Let that sit. We'll come back to it. Right now, I want to take you to where this story actually starts, not with the wave and not even with the harpoon. With a geologist, 20 years before Lockwood's trawler, standing on a beach at low tide, looking at something that shouldn't have been there. The geologist's name is Clement Reid. The year is 1913. He's not looking for a lost world. He's cataloging something much smaller, the stumps of ancient trees exposed at low tide along stretches of the British coast, roots still gripping soil that shouldn't be underwater at all. Peat doesn't form in the sea. That's the detail that matters here, and it's worth sitting with, because everything that follows depends on it. Peat is a land substance. It builds up over centuries in bogs and marshes and forest floors, layer on layer of dead plant matter, compressed, dark, unmistakably terrestrial. You do not get peat on a seabed. You get peat where there was, at some point, dry ground with plants rooted in it, quietly dying and rotting and building up year after year after year. So when Reid finds peat and tree stumps sitting below the tide line, exposed only when the water pulls back twice a day, he's not looking at driftwood. He's looking at proof. Proof that the ground he's standing near used to extend further out than it does now, used to be forest, used to be solid, used to be somewhere you could walk. And he does something that takes a particular kind of nerve for a scientist in 1913. He follows the logic all the way out. If there's drowned forest at the edge of the coast and the seabed keeps going in roughly the same shape for miles beyond it, then the logical floor under that argument isn't the beach. It's the whole basin. Reid writes that the middle of the North Sea itself was once, in his words, something like a vast fen, a colossal expanse of marsh and fen and forest, sitting where ships now sail in open water. He can't prove it. Not really, not in any way that would satisfy a modern peer reviewer. He has no way to get out there and check. No submarine cameras, no sonar, no drilling rigs. He's inferring an entire drowned country from tree stumps on a beach, decades before anyone has the technology to go out and confirm it. Think about the size of that claim for a second. It's one thing to say, this part of the coastline used to be a bit further out. It's another thing entirely to say, there was once a landscape the size of a small nation sitting under what is now one of the busiest, coldest, grayest bodies of water in Europe. Forests, rivers, hills, valleys, and it's all still down there, preserved in the dark and the cold and the silt, waiting. Reid is right. It will take most of the 20th century to prove it, but he's right. And the proof, when it starts arriving, doesn't come from archaeologists digging with brushes and patience. It comes, again and again, from the most unglamorous, unintentional source imaginable, men who are not looking for history at all. Men like Pilgrim Lockwood, men who are trying to catch fish and who keep snagging pieces of a country instead. Because Lockwood's harpoon isn't a one-off. Fishermen working the North Sea have been hauling up strange things in their nets since at least 1874. Mammoth tusks, the bones of lions, worked stone tools, once even a fragment of a human skull, dragged up in trawls meant for herring and cod, and for most of that history, almost all of it went straight back overboard. It was bycatch. It got in the way. It fouled the nets and cost time, and time is money when you're paying a crew by the day. Picture that for a second. Picture what it means that evidence of an entire vanished world was being pulled out of the water, inspected for maybe 10 seconds, and thrown back, over and over, for decades, by men who had no reason to think they were looking at anything but junk. A tusk goes back over the side because it's not fish. A worked flint goes back over the side because nobody on deck knows what a worked flint even looks like. The nets keep dragging across the remains of a country nobody in the boat believes existed, and the country keeps getting treated like debris. Lockwood's harpoon survives that fate by luck as much as anything. Because it's whole, because it's obviously carved, because somebody on that boat in 1931 has the presence of mind to look twice instead of once. It ends up in a museum instead of back on the seabed. And it sits there for decades as an object without a date. Everyone can see it's old. Nobody can say how old, not with any real confidence. That gap, the length of time an object like this can sit in a display case as a curiosity, admired but not truly understood, is worth noticing too. It's not until 1988, well over half a century after Lockwood pulled it out of the muck, that anyone applies radiocarbon dating to the thing. And when the result comes back, it's not the vague, very old everyone had assumed. It's a number, a specific, testable, science-backed number, roughly 11,740 years old, with a margin either side of about 150 years. Sit with that number for a second, because it's easy to let a date like that slide past as just another old-sounding figure. 11,740 years before now means this harpoon was carved and used and eventually lost by someone living on that land, somewhere around 11,900 to 11,300 years before the modern calendar even starts counting backward towards zero. Human beings, not distant human-like ancestors, but people, hunters, with the skill to carve barbs into antler so they'd catch and hold in the flesh of an animal, were living, working, hunting 25 miles from what is now the Norfolk coast, on ground that is today underwater so deep and so cold that Lockwood needed a trawler and a shovel just to touch it by accident. That land had a name, eventually, though not for another 60-odd years. Nobody in 1988, holding that radiocarbon result, was calling it anything at all. It was just the seabed, a blank on the map that happened to be producing carved antler. The name comes from an archaeologist named Bryony in 1998. And what she does isn't just naming, it's an argument dressed up as a name. She calls it Doggerland. After Doggerbank, the shallow sandbank still sitting out there in the middle of the North Sea today. itself named centuries earlier by Dutch fishermen after their boats, which they called doggers. So the name has this strange layered history to it before Coles even gets to her point. A lost world named after a sandbank, named after a boat. But here's the argument underneath the name, and it's the one I want you to actually hold on to, because the popular version of this story gets it wrong at almost every turn. Up to 1998, when people talked about this submerged landscape at all, the word that kept getting used was bridge, a land bridge, something that connected Britain to the European mainland before the water came up. And a bridge is a specific kind of thing. A bridge is something you cross. You don't live on a bridge. You use it to get from one side to the other, and then you're gone. Coles looks at the accumulating evidence, the harpoon, the peat, the tools coming up in trawler nets for over a century, and says, this is wrong. Actively, importantly wrong. This wasn't a bridge. It was a homeland. Think about what that reframe actually demands of you. A bridge in your mind is empty most of the time, a strip of useful geography, functional, forgettable, the thing between the two places that matter. A homeland is where you're born, where your parents are buried, where you learn which berries won't kill you, and where the fish run in spring and which valley floods and which ridge stays dry. A homeland has generations in it, grandparents, children who will have grandchildren of their own on the same ground. Coles is telling you that the object Lockwood pulled out of the sea wasn't dropped by someone passing through on their way to somewhere else. It was dropped, or lost, or left behind by someone who lived there, who had always lived there, as far as they knew, because their parents had lived there, and their parents before them. Doggerland wasn't a hallway, it was a country, with the same kind of rootedness in it that you'd expect from anywhere people have called home for generation after generation. And once you make that shift, once a bridge becomes homeland, the shape of the tragedy changes completely. A bridge disappearing is inconvenient. A homeland disappearing, slowly, over thousands of years, with nobody around long enough to watch the whole arc of it happen, is something closer to an erasure. Coles doesn't have a map, though. Not really. She has scattered points. A harpoon here, a scrap of peat there. Enough to argue for a homeland in principle, not enough to actually show you its rivers, its coastlines, the shape of the land itself. That takes another decade, and it takes something nobody would have predicted. An archaeologist, going looking not for archaeology, but for oil. His name is Vincent Gaffney, and he's leading a team out of the University of Birmingham. And the tool he ends up using isn't a shovel or a core sample. It's data that was never meant for him at all. Seismic survey data, the kind oil and gas companies fire down into the seabed to map where hydrocarbon deposits might be sitting, donated to his team by a company called Petroleum Geo Services. Nobody collected that data to find a lost civilization. It was shot for an entirely different, entirely commercial reason, to find fuel. Gaffney and his team take it anyway, between 2003 and 2007, and they do something with it that nobody who originally collected it had any interest in doing. They reprocess it, run it back through, looking not for the signatures of gas and oil trapped in rock, but for the much older, much stranger signatures of an ancient landscape sitting in the layers above it, the ghost outlines of rivers that stopped flowing thousands of years ago, the shape of a lake basin, the edge of a marsh. It's a little like developing an old roll of spy satellite film decades after it was shot for a completely different purpose, and discovering that buried in the grain of the image, off to one side of whatever the camera was actually pointed at, is a lost city nobody was looking for. The data was never about Doggerland. Doggerland was just sitting there, incidentally, in the noise. What comes back, when the team finishes processing it, is not a vague inference anymore. It's a map. An actual, contoured, detailed map of roughly 23,000 square kilometers of early Holocene landscape, river channels tracing their old courses across the seabed, a major lake and estuary system, the ghost of marshland. 23,000 square kilometers is a landmass on the scale of a small country in its own right, bigger than a lot of nations currently sitting on the map with borders and capitals and populations, and this one is sitting entirely underwater, entirely forgotten, mapped for the first time, not by anyone hunting for it on purpose, but as a byproduct of somebody else's search for fuel. In 2009, Gaffney publishes the results with his colleagues Simon Fitch and David Smith in a book called Europe's Lost World. the rediscovery of Doggerland. And rediscovery is exactly the right word for what's happening here, because everything in that book is confirming, point by point, the argument Clement Reid made from a beach in 1913, using nothing but tree stumps and nerve. Reid was right. He just had to wait 96 years for the technology and the borrowed data to prove it. Now, hold that map in your head for a second, because it's about to get a companion. A map tells you where the land was. It doesn't tell you who was standing on it. That evidence surfaces in 2001 off the Dutch coast, and it doesn't come from a research vessel either. It comes from a dredger, hauling material up from the seabed 15 kilometers out, doing routine industrial work with absolutely no archaeological purpose behind it. Mixed in with that dredged material is a fragment of bone. Frontal bone, the part of a skull that would have sat above the eyes, formed the brow, and when it's examined properly, the shape of it is unmistakable. The brow ridge is heavy, pronounced, curved in a way that modern human skulls simply don't share. It's Neanderthal. This is not a small find dressed up to sound bigger than it is. This is the first hominin fossil ever recovered in the entire history of the Netherlands. Not the first found underwater. The first found at all, anywhere in that country, on land or off it. And it is also the first hominin fossil ever pulled specifically from a submarine deposit, meaning nobody, anywhere, had ever recovered a piece of an ancient human relative's actual body from underneath the sea before this fragment came up in a dredger's haul off the Dutch coast. And it wasn't alone. Alongside it, in the same dredged material, came stone tools, hand axes, and flakes struck off in a particular recognizable technique associated with Neanderthal tool-making. Not one lost item, in other words, but the fingerprint of a working, tool-using, hunting presence, sitting on ground that is now 15 kilometers out under Dutch coastal waters. Think about what that does to the timeline you've been building in your head. Everything up to now, the harpoon, the 23,000 square kilometers of Gaffney's map, has been telling a story about modern humans. Hunter-gatherers, roughly 12,000 years ago, with carved antler and a homeland Bryony coals, insisted on calling by that word instead of bridge. The Neanderthal fragment pushes the story backward into a different chapter of the human story altogether, a species that split off from ours further back, that occupied Europe long before modern humans arrived in any numbers, and that was, apparently, also living, hunting, and dying on ground that is now seabed. Which means Doggerland, or the landscape that would eventually become Doggerland, before that name existed, before the final flooding, before any of it, wasn't only a homeland once. It was a homeland more than once, to more than one kind of human being, across a span of time so long it swallows entire species whole. A single fragment of frontal bone is doing an enormous amount of work here. It's a little like finding one surviving page from a burned library and discovering, when you read it, that it happens to be the one page that proves the whole library existed. Not just a library of one book, but of an entire older wing you didn't know was there. And notice the pattern that's already forming, quietly, underneath every one of these discoveries. Not one of them was made on purpose. Reid inferred a submerged landscape from tree stumps he happened to notice at low tide. Lockwood snagged a harpoon while trying to clear his nets of muck he didn't want. Gaffney's team found a country's outline hiding inside data that was shot to locate gas reserves. And now, a Neanderthal's brow ridge turns up in the belly of a dredger doing entirely unrelated industrial work off the Dutch coast. Nobody set out looking for Doggerland and found it. Doggerland kept turning up in the wreckage of people looking for something else entirely. Fish, fuel, gravel, anything but this. As if the only way a lost world this size gets found at all is by accident over and over for more than a century, because nobody thought to look for it on purpose in the first place. Which raises the obvious question, the one sitting underneath everything so far. If the evidence was always there, snagging in nets and showing up in survey data since at least 1874, why did it take until 1913 for anyone to even guess it was a landscape, and until 2009 to actually see its shape? The answer isn't that people weren't paying attention. The answer is the actual mechanism at work here, and once you understand it, the 100-year delay stops being strange and starts being the whole point of the story. Go back to the end of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago. Enormous ice sheets are sitting across huge stretches of the northern hemisphere, and locked up inside that ice is water. Water that, under different conditions, would be sitting in the ocean instead. As the planet warms and that ice begins to melt, all of that water has to go somewhere, and where it goes is into the sea. Over the roughly 13,000 years that follow, global sea level rises by something in the region of 120 meters. Stop on that figure for a second because it's worth actually picturing rather than just hearing. 120 meters is a 40-story building. It's the length of a football pitch stood on end. That is how much deeper the oceans of the entire planet became, on average, as the ice age ended, and every centimeter of it had to come from somewhere that used to be dry. But, and this is the detail that explains everything about why nobody living through it could have noticed, that rise wasn't smooth. It wasn't a tap turned on at a steady drip. In the earlier phases, the water came up in pulses, sometimes more than 3 meters a century during the fastest stretches, before slowing down markedly by around 7,000 years ago. 3 meters a century sounds fast when you say it like that. It is not fast. It is roughly 3 centimeters a year in the most aggressive pulses, an amount of rise so small, so gradual, that in the time it takes a person to be born, grow up, have children of their own, and grow old, the water might have crept forward by a distance you could span with your arms, spread out over their entire lifetime, absorbed into the landscape a little at a time. That is the mechanism, not a wall of water. A landlord raising the water level by a fraction of an inch every year, so slowly that you never actually clocked the day you had to give up a room. You just realize, decades later, looking back, that you've somehow moved 3 times without ever once deciding to move. And Doggerland doesn't drown all at once under a mechanism like that. It shrinks. Generation on generation, the coastline creeps inward, not dramatically, not all in one place at once, but steadily, relentlessly, until what was once 23,000 square kilometers of river valley and marsh and forest is reduced over thousands of years to a shoal. And then, finally, to something closer to an island, its last high ground clustering around what is today known as Doggerbank, the very sandbank that would eventually lend Bryony her name for the whole lost country. Think about what that means for the people living through any single one of those centuries. A hunter-gatherer community losing a strip of coastline to the water, generation after generation, isn't watching a catastrophe. They're watching what looks from the inside like ordinary bad luck. A storm that ate more of the beach than usual. A river mouth that's shifted since their grandparents' time. A hunting ground that used to be good, that somehow isn't as good anymore. Nothing about any single year, any single decade even, would look like the end of a country. It would just look like life, inconvenient, shifting, the kind of thing you adapt to and move on from, the way people always have. Nobody, at any point across those thousands of years, gets to stand at the edge of the water and say, "This is the day Doggerland began to end." There is no such day. There's only an accumulation of days, none of them dramatic enough on their own to be remembered as anything more than an unlucky season. Which brings us, finally, to the one day in this entire story that actually was dramatic. The one event in 8,000 years of quiet, imperceptible loss that any single person alive at the time absolutely would have noticed, would have felt in their body, would have told their children about in horror for the rest of their life, if they lived to tell it at all. It happens roughly 8,200 years ago off the coast of Norway, and it starts not in the water, but under it, a section of the seabed itself simply letting go. Geologists call it the Storega Slide, and the scale of it is difficult to hold in your head all at once. A section of Norway's continental shelf, roughly 290 kilometers of it, simply gives way and slides downward into the deep ocean basin, all at once, carrying with it something in the region of 3,500 cubic kilometers of rock and sediment and debris. It's one of the largest submarine landslides known to have happened anywhere on the planet. Picture the shelf not as solid, immovable stone, but as a slope that had been holding under enormous pressure for longer than anyone standing on the coast above it could have imagined, until on one particular day, it stopped holding. And when that much material drops that far, that fast, into that much water, the ocean above it has nowhere to go but up and outward in a wave. The models of what that wave actually did when it reached land vary enormously depending on where you're standing, and that variation matters. This isn't a single tidy number, it's a spread, and a wide one. Along the coast of Norway itself, closest to the slide, the modeled run-up is somewhere in the range of 10 to 12 meters. Reaching across to Scotland, the estimate drops to somewhere around 4 to 6 meters. But up in Shetland, closer to the slide, more exposed to it, the modeled wave may have run as high as 20 to 30 meters. And out at the Faroe Islands, estimates put it above 10 meters as well. 20 to 30 meters is not a wave in the way you picture a wave at a beach. It's the height of a 6 to 10-story building, arriving as a wall of moving water, with no warning beyond whatever those few minutes gave anyone standing on the shore. And this isn't speculation built purely from modeling. The physical evidence of that wave is still in the ground, waiting, the same way the peat and the harpoon were waiting for someone to look. Deposits from it have been found in Shetland, in Orkney, along the eastern coast of Scotland, and along England's northwest coast. In some places, sediment linked to that single event has been traced up to 80 kilometers inland. And it shows up too in sediment cores, drilled directly into what used to be Doggerland itself, a layer laid down all at once, sitting in the mud like a scar. Now picture what that day would have looked like for anyone standing on the last remaining high ground of Doggerland, the shrunken island clustered around what's now Dogger Bank, all that remained after thousands of years of the water's slow, patient climb. For 8,000 years, the loss of this land had been happening at a pace no single person could perceive. And then, on one day, for the people standing on what was left of it, the ocean itself seems to rear up and come for them all at once, the one moment in this entire story that would have actually looked to a human being standing there like the ending everyone assumes this story is. This is the version most people already know if they know anything about Doggerland at all. The wave, the single catastrophic night. It fits the Atlantis shape so neatly, one storm, one wall of water, one clean line between before and after, that for a long time, it was simply assumed to be the answer. Case closed. Doggerland drowned because of Storegga on that day, in that hour. But in 2020, a team led by an archaeologist named James Walker, working alongside Vincent Gaffney, the same Gaffney who led the seismic mapping project over a decade earlier, went back to test that assumption directly. And what they found complicates the story in a way that's honestly more unsettling than the wave itself. The team went looking for direct physical evidence of what actually happened to the last surviving sliver of Doggerland when that wave hit it, not modeling the wave itself, but reading the ground it hit. In 2018, as part of a wider mapping effort called Europe's Lost Frontiers, they took vibrocores, long cylindrical samples drilled straight down through the seabed sediment near a site called the Outer Dowsing Deep, close to what would have been the edge of that last remnant of high ground. A vibrocore works a bit like reading tree rings, except instead of years, you're reading events. Each layer of sediment tells you something about the conditions when it was laid down. Calm water, moving water, a violent one-off deposit, a slow, gentle accumulation. Pull the core up, slice it open, and you can read backward through time in the mud itself, layer by layer, like pages in a book nobody has opened in 8,000 years. And what Walker's team found in those layers was not what the tidy version of the story predicts. If the popular narrative were correct, if Storegga were the single clean ending, the night everything went under and stayed under, you'd expect the cores to show exactly that, a violent flood layer, and then nothing but open sea sediment above it forever, because the land was gone. That is not what the sediment shows. Instead, the evidence suggests something more complicated and honestly stranger. The remaining high ground, the last scrap of Doggerland clustered around what's now Doggerbank, appears to have acted as a partial barrier against the wave, blunting it rather than being simply erased by it. And above the flood layer, the sediment record suggests the floodwaters withdrew and the land recovered. Not all of it, not forever, but enough to suggest that this last island of Doggerland, and very plausibly some of the people who were standing on it, survived the wave that has been treated for years as the thing that killed it. I want you to actually sit with how strange that is, because it inverts the entire assumed shape of this story. The wave that everyone points to is the ending, the one dramatic, describable, filmable night in 8,000 years of quiet loss, may not have been the ending at all. According to Walker and Gaffney's reading of the evidence, the land held. People, in all likelihood, watched an ocean rear up and try to take everything from them in a single afternoon, and the ground did not give up. What actually finished it off, according to this model, wasn't the wave. It was the thing that had been doing the work all along, the whole time, in the background, for 8,000 years before that day, and for however long after it. The same slow, patient, unspectacular rise in sea level that had already reduced an entire homeland to an island in the first place. Storega wasn't the executioner. It was closer to a demolition crew arriving to finish off a building that termites had already been hollowing out, quietly, for years. A building that, as it happens, held up better against the demolition than anyone expected and came down anyway, afterward, to something far less dramatic. Now, I want to be honest with you about what this actually is, because it matters. This isn't a settled fact carved into stone. Walker and Gaffney's own paper poses it as a question in its own title, an open question, not a closed one. It's built from vibrocore samples at one location, outer dowsing deep, read carefully and rigorously, but still a model, still an interpretation of limited physical evidence, not a complete forensic reconstruction of exactly what happened to everyone who was standing on that island that day. What it gives us isn't proof of exactly how the story ends. It's strong, physical evidence that the story we've been telling, clean wave, clean ending, is very likely wrong. That's different from certainty about what's right. And here's the part that the evidence genuinely cannot answer, the part that has to stay honestly, permanently unresolved. We don't know what happened to Doggerland's people, in the end, not with any real precision. We don't know whether the last communities retreated westward into what's now Britain as the water kept climbing, whether some retreated east into the continent, whether entire family lines were lost with the final stretches of ground, or in what numbers any of this happened. No credible population estimate exists for how many people this touched at any point across those 8,000 years, and any figure you hear stated with confidence should be treated as speculation dressed up as fact. That not knowing isn't a failure of the story. It's the story. An entire country disappeared slowly enough that no one who lived through any part of it could see the whole shape of what was happening to them. And it disappeared so long ago, so thoroughly, that even now, with radiocarbon dating and seismic mapping and vibro cores pulled straight from the drowned ground itself, we still can't tell you with any certainty what happened to the people who called it home in its final years. We have their harpoon. We have the outline of their rivers. We do not have them. Here's where this stops being a story about one drowned country 8,000 years ago and becomes something else. Because the pattern that erased Doggerland, lost so gradual it sits below the threshold of anyone's ability to notice it happening, isn't unique to one landscape, one era, one stretch of the Holocene. It's a shape that keeps recurring at every scale you look at it, once you know to look for it. Think about a single family in any century watching a storm eat a slightly bigger bite of the coastline than usual. They don't experience that as the beginning of an ending. They experience it as bad luck, a rough season, something you rebuild from the way people always have. It takes losing that same strip of ground 3 times, 5 times across a lifetime before bad luck starts to feel like it might be a pattern instead of a coincidence. And even then, Most people don't live long enough to see the pattern complete itself. They just see their own slice of it and hand the rest to their children as someone else's problem. Now scale that up to the landmass itself. Doggerland doesn't lose its shape in one generation or even 10. It loses its shape across roughly 300 human generations if you space them at about 25 years each. 300 separate lifetimes, each one experiencing nothing more dramatic than the version their parents experienced. Slightly worse, slightly smaller, slightly further from where it used to be. Not one of those 300 generations gets to stand at the edge and say, "This is different. This is the one that matters." Every single one of them thinks they're just living an ordinary life, on ordinary, if occasionally difficult land. That's the pattern. Loss too slow to be witnessed by anyone experiencing it directly, not because the loss isn't real, and not because it isn't total by the end, but because human perception is built for events, not for processes. We're extraordinarily good at noticing a wave. We're almost incapable of noticing a millimeter. And I don't think I can tell you this story honestly without saying the next part out loud, because it's not a metaphor and it's not a stretch. It's the same mechanism still running right now in the present tense. Sea levels are rising again. Today. Not from the same cause, no ice sheet collapsing the way it did after the last glacial maximum, but the physical mechanism, the actual experience of it from ground level, is close enough to make your skin crawl. It's happening in millimeters a year. In some places, at rates that are, by any honest comparison, in the same range as parts of what slowly consumed Doggerland over those 8,000 years. And it is, right now, exactly as imperceptible, day to day, as it was for every single one of those 300 generations who never saw it coming, because there was never a day for them to see. Somewhere on a coastline right now, there's a family calling this year's flooding worse than last year's, and calling it bad luck, calling it a rough season, not because they're foolish, because that is what this kind of loss always looks like from inside it. It looked that way in Doggerland 10,000 years ago, and it looks exactly the same way now, because human beings haven't changed. What we're able to perceive, moment to moment, hasn't changed. Only the water has kept moving. The horror of Doggerland was never really the wave. The wave was the one part of this story dramatic enough to be seen, named, dated, modeled, the one part that fits neatly into the shape a story is supposed to have. The actual horror, the quieter and much larger one, is that an entire country, with rivers and forests and marshland and multiple different kinds of human beings living on it across staggeringly long stretches of time, could be erased at a speed literally beneath what a human life is capable of registering. No one, at any single point along 8,000 years of that erasure, had any reason to believe they were witnessing an ending. They just had reason to believe, generation after generation, that this was simply what the land was like, and that dealing with a slightly smaller version of it than their parents had was simply what living meant. Turn that same lens on yourself for a second, because this isn't really a story about geography. It's a story about the size of a human lifetime measured against the size of a process that doesn't care how long you live. You experience your own life as a fairly stable thing. The room you're sitting in feels solid. The coastline near you, if you live near one, feels like a fixed line on a map, the same shape it was when you were a child, the same shape it'll be next year. That feeling of stability isn't a lie exactly. It's just a measurement problem. You are built to notice a wave breaking over a seawall. You're not built to notice the seawall being 3 centimeters closer to your door than it was the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. Every one of the hunter-gatherers who ever stood on Doggerland felt exactly that same stability. Solid ground under their feet, a horizon that looked the same as it had the week before, a home that felt permanent because permanence is what the present moment always feels like, from inside it. They weren't wrong to feel that. They were only wrong about the time scale. The ground actually was stable, hour to hour, day to day, even year to year, in any way a human nervous system could detect. It just wasn't stable across the scale that mattered. The scale of 300 generations, a scale no single person, however attentive, however careful, is built to perceive directly. That's the part that should sit uneasily with you, longer than a wave ever could. A wave is a threat you can see coming, brace for, run from, or fail to run from. A discrete, terrible, comprehensible event. What erased Doggerland was not that. It was a threat with no moment in it at all, no instant where fear would have been the correct response, because there was never a single instant that looked dangerous. Every day of those 8,000 years looked, to the person living inside it, like an ordinary day on ordinary land. The danger was real for the entire span, and undetectable for the entire span at the same time. You are right now living inside a process with exactly that shape. Not identical in cause, the mechanism driving today's sea level rise isn't the same as the one that drowned the Mesolithic hunting grounds off Norfolk, but identical in the one property that actually matters here. It is happening at a speed you were never built to feel. Your body has no sensor for millimeters per year. Your instincts, tuned by however many 100,000 years of evolution, are built to flinch from a wave, not from a decimal point. And that gap between what's actually happening to the world you live in and what you're capable of noticing is happening is the exact same gap that swallowed an entire homeland and left almost no one alive at any point along the way who could tell you they'd seen it coming. The harpoon Lockwood pulled out of the Morlog in 1931 wasn't dropped by someone who knew they were living through an ending. It was dropped most likely on an ordinary day by someone doing ordinary work, on ground that felt, in that moment and every moment before it, exactly as permanent as the ground under you feels right now. And here's the part that reaches further than sea level, further than coastlines, into something closer to the center of what it means to be a body moving through time at all. Everything about you, your bones, the calcium in them, the water making up most of your weight right now, is also moving through a process too slow for you to feel, on a much shorter timescale than 8,000 years, but with exactly the same shape. Cells replace themselves, tissue rebuilds itself imperfectly over and over, and every rebuild is very slightly different from the one before it. You are not the same physical arrangement of matter you were a decade ago. You didn't feel that happen either. There was no morning where you woke up and could point to the exact moment your body had become a different body than the one you started with. It just happened, underneath the noticing, the way it always does. That's not a comforting parallel, and I'm not going to pretend it is. But there's something almost steadying too in what the Doggerland record actually shows us if you look at the whole of it rather than just the ending. Because the record isn't only a record of loss. 11,740 years is how long that harpoon sat in the ground, and then the water before anyone touched it again. 23,000 square kilometers of a landscape's shape survived well enough in the sediment and the seismic data to be reconstructed almost exactly, 96 years after Reid first guessed at it from a beach. A single fragment of frontal bone was enough to prove an entire chapter of hominin presence that would otherwise have left no trace anyone would ever find. The ground didn't just erase everything that happened on it, it kept the evidence. Slowly, patiently, in the same cold and the same dark that took the land in the first place, it kept enough of the story to eventually be told. There's something in that worth sitting with, before the water even enters the picture again. Loss, this total, this thorough, still leaves a residue. Not always the residue you'd choose, not always the residue that answers every question you have, but a residue all the same. The peat under the low tide, the moorlog dragged up in the nets, the bone in the dredger's haul. None of it set out to survive. It simply didn't fully disappear, and 100 years later, that was enough for someone patient enough to look and think for a moment about what's still down there, unfound. The map Gaffney's team produced covers a substantial stretch of that lost landscape, but it's built from data collected for an entirely different purpose over a limited window of years across a basin that spans far more territory than any single seismic survey was ever going to capture in full. 23,000 square kilometers is what's been reconstructed. It is not, by any honest accounting, the whole of what was once there. There is more of Doggerland's shape sitting in data nobody has reprocessed yet, in cores nobody has drilled yet, in fishing grounds where a trawler somewhere, on an ordinary working night, not unlike Pilgrim Lockwood's, is dragging its net across ground that used to have a name. used to have a family standing on it, and hasn't been touched by anyone curious enough to ask what it used to be. That's the strange privilege of a story like this one. It isn't finished. Reid's guess in 1913 sat unconfirmed for nearly a century. The harpoon sat undated for over 50 years. The Neanderthal fragment sat unexamined in dredged material until somebody bothered to look closely at what should have been discarded as debris. Every major turn in this story has come from someone deciding, often decades after the evidence first surfaced, that something written off as junk deserved a second look. There is no reason to think that process has stopped. There is no reason to think everything worth finding down there has already been found, which means somewhere in a museum drawer or a shipping container of unprocessed survey tape or the next haul of moor log, some fisherman shovels irritably back toward the deck before thinking better of it. There is very likely something else still waiting. Another fragment, another harpoon, another sliver of the same drowned country, sitting exactly where it's been sitting for thousands of years, patient in a way nothing living could ever manage to be, for as long as it takes somebody to notice. There's a piece of the mechanism I skipped past too quickly, and it's worth slowing down for, because it changes what sea level rising actually means at ground level. When people hear sea level rise, they tend to picture only one thing happening: the ocean itself getting bigger. More water poured into the same basin, the surface creeping upward everywhere at once, evenly, like a bathtub filling. That's real. And it's the dominant piece of the mechanism. Scientists call it eustatic change, and it's driven by exactly what you'd expect: ice sheets melting, adding volume to the world's oceans as a whole, everywhere, all at once. But there's a second process running underneath that one, at the same time, and it's stranger, because it isn't about the water at all. It's about the land itself moving. For tens of thousands of years, enormous ice sheets sat on top of huge stretches of northern Europe. And ice is heavy, heavy enough that the sheer weight of it pressed the land underneath it downward, the way a mattress dips under someone lying on it. When that ice melts and the weight lifts, the land doesn't snap back up instantly. It rebounds slowly, over thousands of years, some regions rising, and, this is the part that matters for Doggerland, other regions, further from where the heaviest ice sat, actually sinking, tilting downward as the ground around them lifts. Geologists call this isostatic change, and for the southern basin of the North Sea, it worked against the people living there in exactly the wrong direction. Even setting aside how much water the ocean itself was gaining, the ground under Doggerland's southern reaches was, in places, quietly subsiding on its own. So the water wasn't only rising toward the land. In places, the land was sinking to meet it. Two separate processes running on different clocks, driven by entirely different physics, one global, one regional, compounding on top of each other, both invisible at human timescales, both aimed at the same outcome. If you'd been able to explain this to someone standing on Doggerland 8,000 years ago, they wouldn't have had a word for either mechanism. They would only have had the result. The water keeps winning, for reasons that have nothing to do with anything they did or could have done differently. Picture for a moment what the landscape those people were actually losing looked like, based on what Gaffney's reprocessed seismic data actually showed. Not a featureless plain slowly swallowed by an anonymous gray sea, but a real, structured, resource-rich landscape, river channels threading across it, a major lake and estuary system sitting at its heart, the kind of wetland mosaic that, anywhere else in the world, in any other era, would be described as prime hunting and fishing territory. Wetlands like that mean reliable fresh water. They mean fish runs, and the birds that follow fish runs, and the animals that come to drink at a lake's edge on a predictable schedule. An experienced hunter could plan an entire season around. This wasn't marginal ground people were clinging to out of desperation. By every indication the mapped landscape gives us, it was some of the richest, most viable territory available to hunter-gatherer communities anywhere in that part of the world at the time. Which makes the loss of it, generation by generation, even harder to sit with. These weren't people barely surviving on a hostile scrap of coastline, watching the sea finally take something they'd always known was fragile. They were losing, a little at a time, one of the best places available to be alive at that moment in human history. River valleys and lake shores and marshland that had fed families for longer than any of those families could trace back. And they lost it in a way that never once presented itself as loss. It presented itself as a lake that used to be a little bigger, a river mouth that used to sit somewhere slightly different, a hunting ground that this year didn't quite produce the way it used to. Every one of those small disappointments would have had a mundane local explanation available. A bad breeding season, an unlucky year of storms, a shift in where the animals chose to graze. Nothing about any single disappointing season would have pointed toward the true cause, because the true cause wasn't visible in any single season. It only becomes visible if you could somehow live for 300 lifetimes and compare the first to the last side by side, which no one ever could, and no one ever did, until Gaffney's team did it for them, retroactively, from data shot to find gas more than 8,000 years after the fact. Take a breath. That's the sound of nothing, right now, wherever you are. No wave, no siren, no announcement. That's what it always sounds like, in the moment before something changes too slowly to notice. Somewhere out under the North Sea tonight, a trawler is working the dark, the same way Pilgrim Lockwood's was nearly a century ago. Its nets are dragging across ground that used to have rivers on it, and a lake, and a family standing at the edge of that lake, watching for fish, certain, the way you're certain right now about the ground under you, that it would still be there tomorrow. It wasn't the wave that took it from them. It was every ordinary day they never thought to doubt. We still don't know their names. We don't know how many of them there were, or which direction they walked in when the water finally left them nowhere else to stand. All we have is a harpoon, a map built from someone else's oil survey, a fragment of a brow ridge pulled from a dredger by accident, and 8,000 years of proof that an entire country can end without anyone ever getting to watch it happen. So the next time the ground under you feels permanent, and it will, because that's what the present always feels like, remember that it felt exactly that permanent to them too, right up until it wasn't there anymore.